It's late 2001 in New Jersey. An Albanian immigrant living in the greater New York City area has been called to a meeting at a gas station along the Jersey Turnpike. That man is Alex Rudaj, a gang leader in Queens who had muscled in on the wrong turf. He and his enforcers, Ljusa Nikolovic, Nikola Dede, and Nardino Colotti, had attacked a gambling club overseen by Arnold Squitieri, a mafia boss. Squitieri met Rudaj at the gas station, along with 20 armed Italian gangsters, and told him to back off. Dede then responded by pointing a shotgun at a gas pump and threatening to kill everyone there with one blow. You see, in the early 2000s, a new force was emerging in New York City's criminal underworld, one that would challenge the established Italian crime families that had dominated organized crime for generations. They came from a small and unstable Balkan nation, bringing with them a code of honor called besa, an appetite for violence, and an audacity that stunned even seasoned mobsters like Squitieri. But they also stunned the FBI, who were now actively hunting them down all over the East Coast. This wasn't the story of business-savvy immigrants trying to assimilate into the American dream. This was the story of soldiers, men who'd survived a nation's collapse, civil war, and a communist regime that had imprisoned them behind closed borders for decades. They arrived in America hungry and traumatized, and were willing to do whatever it took to survive, including murder. This is the story of the Albanian Mafia in New York, how they rose from the ashes of their homeland's destruction to become what the FBI now considers one of the fastest-growing criminal threats in the world. We'd like to announce that we've actually launched 2 new offshoot channels for weekly content that didn't make the cut for this page or were too short to make a full video on. If you like gangster and mafia content like this, be sure to go subscribe to our other pages and show some support. The links are in the description below, along with the link to our Buy Me a Coffee and our official email list. Now on to the video.
In this case, the gun is legal, one of thousands licensed in response to the growth of illegal weapons. The task force have been successful, at least in part, in restraining the armed gangs of Albania. This flatbed truck they confiscated came battle-ready, an ominous clue to the belligerent intentions of its former owners. The staff at Flores Central Hospital are too well aware of the effects that this gun culture is having upon the local community. They have become experts in dealing with every manner of gunshot wounds.
To understand Albanian organized crime in New York, we need to understand what these men were running from. Albania emerged from World War II under the iron grip of communist dictator Enver Hoxha, whose regime would become known as the most repressive totalitarian government in Europe.
Armiqtë e partisë dhe popullit tonë, imperialistët dhe revizionistët, na kanë halë në sy dhe na urrejnë. Ata kanë halë në sy pozitën strategjike të vendit tonë dhe pasuritë e tij të mëdha. Ata tërbohen kur shohin se brenda në prapavijat e tyre, një vend I vogël dhe një popull heroik lufton me heroizëm dhe me këmbëngulje për të mbrojtur lirinë në pavarësinë e tij dhe ndërton me sukses socializmin.
In 1967, his government outlawed all religion. Through sheer terror, the regime systematically destroyed age-old moral values, traditions, and self-respect that had governed Albanian society for centuries. The country was completely isolated internationally, its economy in ruins. Albanian citizens were trapped, unable to leave, watched constantly by secret police called the Sigurimi. This was the Albania that shaped the men who would later terrorize New York's underworld. Things got even worse when the communist governments across the Balkans collapsed in the early 90s, and Albania attempted a shaky transition. The country was desperately poor, its infrastructure crumbling, and its people starving for opportunity.
What rule of law there is consists of heavily armed and often heavily disguised special forces police officers. In the current turmoil, they're incapable of investigating crime. Instead, the best they can hope for is to attempt to limit future crime by stopping the flow of weapons around the country.
What followed was chaos. Thieves ran rampant, children were kicked out of government-sponsored orphanages, and the new government was just as corrupt as the last one. Then came the pyramid schemes. During the 1990s, with Albania's legitimate financial system in shambles, 2/3 of the country's citizens invested in financial schemes that promised fantastic returns. The schemes were run by former government agents and Romani thieves, and at their peak, the value of these schemes' liabilities amounted to almost half of Albania's entire GDP. But pyramid schemes always collapse. And when they did, in 1997, the majority of investors lost everything and the country exploded into mass rioting. Opposition parties began opening up the prisons and releasing the inmates, and all manner of guns and munitions were abandoned across the country, free for the taking by said inmates. One young Albanian, Ketiol Manoku, who would later be convicted of murder in Michigan, remembered 1997 vividly during a 2011 prison interview. One day, a 17-year-old Manoku and his friends were sitting outside a mechanic shop when a car pulled up. One man in the car brandished an AK-47, pointed it at one of his friend's chests, and shot his friend to death. This was Albania in 1997, and the Albania that would shape Manoku into a killer just 7 years later. In the midst of this chaos, one thing remained constant: besa, usually translated as faith or trust. Besa is more accurately understood as to keep the honor. The word appears in the Kanun, a set of traditional Albanian laws dating back to at least the 15th century, originally passed down through oral tradition. Besa was the highest authority, a pledge of honor as solemn as a blood oath. This code would become the foundation of Albanian organized crime. Criminal gangs were formed by men who were related or who had known each other since childhood. Besa bound them for life, and so betrayal was almost unthinkable. But this code, similar to the omerta in the Italian Mafia, came with extreme violence. Albanian gangs quickly became known for their willingness to use brutal force, and they brought that with them when they came to the United States in the early 2000s. Albanians began arriving in New York in large numbers in the 1960s, initially settling in Italian neighborhoods in the Bronx. But it was after Albania's near financial collapse in 1997 that Albanian crime groups rapidly expanded in the United States. By the early 2000s, Europol, the FBI, and Interpol all recognized Albanian organized crime groups as a major threat. What linked all these Albanian groups were besa and extreme violence. Albania's geographic location made it perfect for drug trafficking. Situated between countries like Afghanistan and Turkey that produced heroin, and the Western European countries that consumed it, Albanian criminals became the middlemen. By the early 2000s, Albanian criminal networks were powerful enough to challenge New York's established crime families. FBI supervising agent Lou Di Gregorio, who had worked on the Italian Mafia for 20 years, kept a copy of the Kanun on his desk. He said the Albanians reminded him of the old-school Italian Mafia before the American-born mafiosi came of age. Still poor, still hungry, and still desperate. To understand the Albanian Mafia's influence in New York, you have to start in Michigan. Macomb and Oakland counties, just outside Detroit, became home to a significant Albanian immigrant population. The area was full of strip malls with fast food restaurants where many Albanian immigrants worked. Albanian cafes, bars, and restaurants dotted the landscape. This was Little Albania, and it's where some of the most violent Albanian criminals in America operated. Men like Ketiol Manoku, Oligir Merko, and Edmond Zoitsa, soldiers who lived by a code learned in the Balkans and brought to American streets. These weren't mobsters in suits driving Cadillacs. Manoku hated the hip-hop style many gangsters adopted. He wasn't rich or looking to get rich. He was just a soldier doing what soldiers do. Ketiol Manoku, who arrived in 2001, snuck in through Mexico speaking no English. He initially worked in restaurants, but quickly moved into muscle work, persuading people to pay debts to criminals. Albanian criminals were smuggling migrants into America for fees of $12,000. They'd pay $8,000 up front, but once in America, many refused to pay the rest. Manoku was the guy sent to convince them to settle up. He said in one case, he had to break a man's teeth and did time in county jail for it. Manoku hung out in Albanian coffee shops in the Detroit area, where he met the infamous Krasniqi brothers, Bruno and Samir, and other Albanian gangsters like Drini Brahimallari. In July 2004, tensions between Albanian groups in Michigan erupted into violence. There had been a fight between a man named Kutiim Karapici and Brahim Malari. Karapici was a part of the North Boys gang, while Brahim Malari was with Menoku. Menoku and his crew then kidnapped Karapici. They picked him up in a parking lot and forced him into their car, while Menoku pointed a gun at him and Zoitsa pulled a knife. Menoku's gun went off accidentally, causing Karapici to jump out of the car and run. 2 weeks later, Karapici was summoned again, this time to the parking lot of the Tirana Cafe. He was picked up and driven to Brahim Malari's apartment where Mirko and Florian Charchani were waiting. Plastic was laid on the floor, presumably to catch blood. 10 to 20 kitchen knives were laid out on a table. Mirko cursed at Karapici, threatened him, and told him he had disrespected him. Karapici pled for his life, and Mirko let him live because he begged. Mirko then gave him an ultimatum. He had 2 days to come up with $1,000 for Brahim Malari's medical bills from their fight, or he'd be shot. Karapici told his father everything. The next day, he and his dad met with members of Menoku's crew at a public park. His father paid and asked for his son to be left alone. When a journalist later reached out to Karapici in 2011, he responded, "I have moved on and things are going good for me. Thank you for understanding." While Q managed to get out of the gangland world and progress in his life, the same couldn't be said for Menoku. On the night of July 17, 2004, around 11:30 p.m., Menoku was hanging in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Clausen. His friend Oliger Mirko was getting married the next day. As Menoku would later testify, a van rolled into the parking lot with 5 North Boys in it. Before an AK-47 was pointed out the window of the vehicle, Menoku dove under a bush where a 9mm was stashed and pulled it out. The car accelerated toward him, and Menoku fired. One of the 5, 20-year-old Markiol Yaku, was shot dead. Prosecutors later charged Menoku, Mirko, and Zoitsa with conspiracy and premeditated murder, asserting that they had plotted over time to kill the North Boys more than once, while Charchani testified against them. As evidence, they referenced a coffee shop shooting and a mid-traffic AK-47 drive-by committed by Menoku's crew. Zoitsa received a life sentence. Mirko received 8 life sentences, and Menoku received 10, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Zoitsa, Menoku, and Mirko still sit behind bars over 20 years after that fateful July wedding night. The Krasniqi brothers, Samir and Bruno, were different from street soldiers like Menoku. They wore suits and had nice haircuts and drove Cadillacs. A law enforcement source called them gentlemen gangsters. They ran a drug trafficking operation that imported hundreds of pounds of marijuana from Canada and distributed it throughout New York and beyond. The Krasniqis had a crew, and they worked with other Albanian criminals like Parid Gjoka, operating out of Albanian coffee shops in Ridgewood, Queens. The thing that would both help them rise up and destroy them a few years later was their keen sense for weakness and rivals. They weren't afraid to use violence to take over territories and business, even from their own friends. One of the men they sensed weakness in was Gjoka, a young and successful drug dealer from Albania and once a very close friend to the Krasniqi brothers. But he was different from the fold of gangsters in New York's underworld. He felt too much emotion, cried at loss, and couldn't kill his own friends. On October 19, 2004, Gjoka's girlfriend, a singer named Anita Bitri, died from carbon monoxide poisoning in her Staten Island home alongside her mother and her 8-year-old daughter. Gjoka had noticed her sudden disappearance and out of concern broke into her home to find all 3 of them dead. This sent Gjoka into a state of depression that led to him crying too much, getting high, talking about love every day, and more signs of immense grief. It was around that same time that the Krasniqi brothers decided he shouldn't be making all the money. They turned on Gjoka and his friend Arion Sheyu, aka Lanka, who ran gambling rings in Astoria for Alex Rudaj. The brothers began shooting up his bars and refusing to pay their debts to him, and then stole 25 pounds of marijuana from Gjoka. Florencella, Skindert Sakoni, and Parid Gjoka then went to murder Bruno outside a strip club in Astoria on a July 2005 night. But as they aimed their guns, Gjoka couldn't get himself to kill his former friend, but Bruno Krasniqi could. Bruno purchased Uzis from Menoku in Detroit, as well as bulletproof vests. Later in July, Bruno, Samir, and Gentian Casa drove to the Cafe Amici in Queens, watched Shehu exit the cafe, and shot him 20 times. Casa was later gunned down in 2007 when he and Redinal Dervishe, the brother of a major Albanian drug dealer, invaded the home of Ragnar Cafe owner Lulzim Kupi. They threatened his family at gunpoint to extort him, but Kupi shot back, killing Casa and running Dervishe out. The Joka crew fell apart after Sheyu's murder, and soon afterwards, things went under fire for the Krasniqis after ripping off a Toronto weed supplier. The supplier, Claudio Prendi, forced Erenik Grezda, a drug connect to the Krasniqis, to set up Bruno to be kidnapped. Grezda lured Bruno to a November 25, 2005 meeting where he was kidnapped, beaten, dragged to Ohio, and was held captive by an Arab gangster before being driven to the home of Frank Shastani. They called Samir and told him that he owed them $350,000 for his brother's life. Samir and his lawyer were pushed by a judge to contact the FBI, who sat with him, and he openly lied about his criminal activity. The FBI and a SWAT team mobilized and followed Samir out to a drop point on November 27th. The trade-off for the ransom took place near Detroit, and police arrested Shastani and tried to get him to flip and catch Claudio. Claudio, now afraid, dumped a still-living Bruno in a field and called Samir. And now, Grezda had to die. On the night of January 16, 2005, Samir, Bruno, Elton Sedaris, and Grezda all got into Sedaris' mother's old car to drive to Connecticut for a money pickup to allegedly pay off Claudio Prendi before Samir turned up the music, and Bruno shot Greznik dead in the car, dumping him off the BQE. By 2011, however, the Krasniqis' luck had run out. The FBI had been building a case against them for years, and that summer, the murder and drug trafficking trials of the Krasniqi brothers and their associates finally got underway in Manhattan. The trials revealed the inner workings of Albanian organized crime in New York, the drug routes from Canada through Detroit to the Bronx, the internal wars between rival crews, and the violence that was a routine part of doing business. The Detroit coffee shops where Minoku met the Krasniqis were just one node in a much larger network that stretched from Canada to Albania, from the Bronx to Chicago, and because of their involvement in that supply chain, they received several life sentences in 2011. While the Krasniqi brothers were operating in New York and the Minoku crew was causing mayhem in Michigan, another major Albanian organized crime network was thriving in New Jersey. This operation was headed by two men, Kwitim Timmy Lika, a baseball cap-wearing gambler, and Mifit Mike Dika, who sported a conspicuous tattoo of a bald eagle on his left bicep and the words, "Death Before the Sun," on his right arm. The FBI began investigating Lika and Dika in late 2003. What they discovered was a massive criminal enterprise that would become the target of Operation Black Eagle, the largest undercover infiltration of Albanian organized crime in FBI history. This was a 4-year investigation that would culminate in 2009 with the largest federal racketeering case against an Albanian crime syndicate in the United States. The 26-strong gang was tight-knit and hard to penetrate. Like the Italian Mafia, Albanian organized crime gangs were difficult to crack because of family ties and besa, the code of honor that made betrayal almost unthinkable. But what made it even harder for law enforcement was that there was little evidence of any real structure or hierarchy. The Albanians didn't operate like the Italians with clear chains of command. They were fluid and had simple corporations. The gang used planes to import their drugs. In 2009, 2 aging pilots were caught flying 10 kilos of cocaine from Florida to the Ocean City airport in exchange for $15,000. They were part of Lika and Dika's network, which had been operating for years and had ties to Albania, Macedonia, Kosovo, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. The network was headquartered in Paterson, New Jersey, the same city where Oliver Mirko from Detroit had fled and been arrested after the wedding night shooting. The suspects used planes to import ecstasy, OxyContin, and marijuana from Canada and cocaine from Florida. They also discussed importing ecstasy from the Netherlands and heroin from Serbia and Turkey. The FBI infiltrated the operation and purchased over 30,000 ecstasy pills, 2.5 kilograms of heroin, and stolen jewelry. Wiretaps and video surveillance at the Royal Warsaw Restaurant in Elmwood Park and the Borgata Casino in Atlantic City eventually led to arrests, however. Undercover agents began offering illegal services, mostly money laundering. The takedown happened over 5 days in the chilly spring of 2009. 26 people were ultimately charged with a laundry list of crimes, including narcotics and firearms trafficking, money laundering, interstate transportation of stolen property, and criminal conspiracy. A Bentley and 2 private jets were seized. But in that spring 2009 operation, only 22 members of the gang were arrested. Among the 4 the FBI failed to capture were the 2 ringleaders, Timmy Lika and Mike Dika. Gazmir Joka, another fugitive, was arrested in Albania in November 2009, but Lika and Dika had vanished. They'd fled to Toronto, where a significant Albanian population could help them hide. The FBI put them on the most wanted list, and their cases were even featured on America's Most Wanted. Mike Dika remained at large until January 2010. The Toronto Fugitive Task Force tracked him down and arrested him during a car stop on a Monday afternoon. The FBI said tips generated by the America's Most Wanted episode helped lead to his arrest. Dika, described by the FBI as a 45-year-old Wyckoff, New Jersey restaurant worker, had entered Toronto in August 2009 and gone underground after the March FBI operation that saw most of his associates arrested. Dika was held in custody in Toronto, fighting extradition for 2 years, but the kingpin everyone really wanted was still free.
Police say so far they have found 13 passports and applications intended not just for Rabi Al-Khalil, but his brother too, Nabil, a convicted cocaine trafficker, and other known associates.
His search continued for another 2 years. Toronto Police and the Canada Border Services Agency worked together, searching for the fugitive Albanian mob boss. Finally, on Thursday, May 24th, 2012, they got a tip, and the fugitive squad arrested Lika the next morning in a joint investigation. The then 47-year-old Lika appeared disheveled and messy within his small apartment. Years of living high as a gangster, just to go on the run for 3 highly stressful years and then get caught and sentenced regardless. Another massive Albanian drug trafficking operation was flourishing not too far away, in Queens. At its center was a man named Enos Jerkovich, known simply as E, who would later be described as the underboss of the Albanian Mafia. Jerkovich ran his operation from 2000 to 2009, nearly a decade of moving massive quantities of drugs through Forest Hills, Queens, and up and down the East Coast. His network imported over 100,000 kilograms, that's over 220,000 pounds, of high-grade hydroponic marijuana from Canada into the United States through the Akwesasne Native American Reservation on the U.S.-Canadian border. The Akwesasne Reservation became a critical smuggling corridor for Albanian organized crime. The reservation straddles the border between New York and Canada, making it ideal for traffickers. Jerkovich's organization used every method imaginable to move drugs across: speedboats racing across waterways, ATVs tearing through forests and fields, tractor-trailers with hidden compartments, and regular cars modified to conceal contraband. Once smuggled across the border, the marijuana was shipped to distributors throughout the East Coast, with the bulk ending up in the tri-state area. A multi-year investigation by the Long Island DEA slowly unraveled Jerkovich's empire, but it was a lot harder than it seemed, as Jerkovich didn't tolerate mistakes. He understood exactly what power cost and how cheaply human loyalty could be bought or broken. But every empire has its weak points, and Jerkovich's weak point turned out to be a man named Mercim Merv Kolinovic. On February 20th, 2008, Kolinovic was pulled over by police in Queens for a traffic violation. He was driving a 2006 Lexus without license plates. It should have been routine, but when police searched the vehicle, they found 18 Ziploc bags of marijuana in the trunk. Kolinovic was arrested and charged with criminal possession of marijuana and driving without a license. Slobodan Pavicevic, a passenger in the car, was also arrested. Unlike Pavicevic, however, Kolinovic cracked immediately and flipped. He agreed to cooperate with federal authorities and wore a wire, leading the DEA straight into the heart of Jerkovich's operation. One federal official familiar with the case later said, "His sloppiness led to this bust. He was driving with a suspended license while carrying 9 pounds of pot." With Kolinovic's cooperation, the DEA began building their case. They conducted surveillance, gathered evidence, and slowly mapped out the entire network. The investigation revealed connections stretching from Canada to Chicago, Detroit, Texas, and back to Macedonia and Albania. When the DEA finally moved in, the bust became legendary. Agents seized 50,000 pounds of marijuana. The street value was estimated at $120 million to $150 million. The high-quality marijuana was grown in hydroponic farms inside homes in British Columbia, then driven east to the St. Regis Mohawk Reservation on the Canada-New York border, where smugglers crossed into New York State. From there, it was distributed through Jerkovich's network in Forest Hills and beyond. In 2012, Jerkovich was sentenced to 30 years in prison and a $2 million fine. But while awaiting sentencing, he manufactured death threats against the judge, prosecutors, and DEA agents, enlisting his sister to deliver threatening notes. When discovered, he was charged with obstruction of justice as well. He was released in late 2025 and is now a free man, allegedly back on the street. To understand Albanian organized crime's full scope, we'll go back to Alex Rudaj, an ethnic Albanian from Montenegro who immigrated in 1987. Rudaj would become boss of what prosecutors called the most significant Albanian organized crime group in America, more than the Krasniqis, Jerkovich, and Dika. The Rudaj organization, called the Corporation by its former members during its heyday, started in the early 1990s in the Bronx. It was headed by Rudaj, an Italian-American Nardino Collotti, who had ties to Gambino Mafia soldier Phil Skinny Loscalzo. When Loscalzo died and Colati didn't receive his territory, they became independent and founded the corporation in 1993. This was the birth of the corporation, a multi-ethnic family that federal authorities called New York's sixth crime family, standing alongside the traditional 5 mafia families. The organization had Greek, Arab, and Italian soldiers, though most were Albanian. They operated gambling dens that generated millions annually, but they weren't satisfied with territories given by the Italians. They wanted more and were willing to become disrespectful to get it. In August 2001, Rudaj enforcer Ljusa Nukilovic led an attack on a Greek social club called Soccer Fever in Queens. He and 6 men, including Rudaj, entered with guns, beat patrons, overturned gambling tables, and grabbed money. They then knocked a player unconscious and left. After the attack on the Gambino-operated Greek gambling house, Colati met with Anthony Magali, the second in command of the Gambino family, and negotiated terms for Rudaj. Colati served as a connect to the Italian Mafia more than once, due to his heritage and already existing connections with Loscalzo. Feds watched him meet with Joseph Caridi, the consigliere of another family named the Lucchese Mafia, after Rudaj began muscling into Lucchese gambling houses. In another case, Rudaj, Colati, and gang enforcer Nicola Nicky Nails Dide attacked and beat a bar owner they'd loaned money to. He refused to pay and give up his bar to them instead. So Colati tried biting his ear off while Dide stuck a gun in his face. Weeks later, Gambino family acting boss Arnold Squitieri, aka Zeke, arranged a meeting at a New Jersey Turnpike rest area. He brought 20 armed Gambino mobsters with bats and guns as an overwhelming show of force. Meanwhile, Rudaj brought only 6 men. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. Squitieri told them to stop expanding, and like a scene from an action film, both sides pulled weapons. The Italians had the numbers, but knowing they were outnumbered, the Albanians threatened to blow up the gas station with everyone in it. One pointed a gun to Squitieri's head, while Nicola Dide pointed a shotgun at a gas pump, his finger on the trigger. Had Squitieri's thugs pulled their guns, Dide would have shot his. The corporation was willing to blow themselves up for respect. Squitieri eventually backed down and left, but Rudaj wouldn't remain so cocky for long. Talks were held afterwards, and he was eventually pushed back from his rapid expansion and told to calm down. The corporation's audacity peaked at Rao's, the legendary East Harlem Italian restaurant. In 2003, Rudaj showed up demanding John Gotti's old table. Gotti had died just 1 year prior, after spending the last decade of his life in a tiny 23-hour lockdown prison cell, cancer-ridden, and with many of his family members and friends facing life in prison or murdered. When refused the table, he returned with dozens of cronies. After a short and threatening conversation with the owner, the table became his. It was a signal that the Albanians demanded respect within organized crime. The corporation operated through fear. Federal prosecutor Jennifer Rogers detailed brutal beatings that showed fear was their chief means of control. One defendant was lauded for strangling an old man with a shoelace, quote, until his eyes were popping out of his head. Another complained that a beating victim dirtied his pants with blood. Nicola Dide, the corporation's chief enforcer, described how they took over territory. Quote, they make mistakes somewhere, we move in and take it. While the Mafia was being locked behind bars in the early 2000s, namely the Gambino family administration, the Albanians moved fast and took their business. But nothing good lasts forever, and in Rudaj's case, it didn't really last very long. The FBI investigation was massive. Up to a dozen agents worked the case over 5 years using wiretaps, surveillance, and informants. On October 26, 2004, the FBI arrested Rudaj and 21 others. The charges included racketeering, attempted murder, extortion, and illegal gambling. It was the first federal racketeering case against an organized Albanian criminal enterprise. 7 years before, the Krasniqis suffered the same fate. The following trial then lasted 3 months. On June 16, 2006, Rudaj was sentenced to a whopping 27 years in federal prison. Over 20 members were ultimately charged, 6 top leaders were convicted, and 10 more pleaded guilty. The 6th family had fallen in just 5 years. If all goes well for Rudaj, he will be out of prison in 2 years, returning to a world vastly different from the one he'd been incarcerated in, but to a gangland scene that hasn't changed aside from simply the names of the men involved. After Rudaj's arrest, it was alleged that Redinal Dervishe took his place, and that Enes Jerkovich is now leading the Albanian mob.